What's going on, guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today we will be comparing two pure mid-engine sports cars that came out in the last few years. We're sitting right now in a 2020 Lotus Evora GT with a 6-speed automatic transmission, and we'll be comparing it to a 2018 Porsche Cayman GTS with a manual transmission. The MSRP of this Lotus as spec'd is $109,000, whereas the Cayman GTS is just under $100K at $94,000. So in this test, we're going to find out how these two cars compare on a canyon road, the way they're meant to be driven, not necessarily on a racetrack. So a few specs about this Evora GT. It has a 6-speed automatic torque converter transmission. You can also get this with a 6-speed manual, which I've driven before. The shifts are sloppy. It's hard to downshift. This car is powered by a 3.5-liter Toyota supercharged V6, making 416 horsepower. This car weighs a touch over 3,100 pounds. Double wishbone suspension, front and rear, and we're on some Michelin Pilot Sport Cup 2 tires. The OEM brakes are from AP Racing, and we've got hydraulic power steering. By the way, out of that $109,000 MSRP that I mentioned, $6,000 of that is from just this Daytona blue paint alone. All right, let's see how this car performs. We've got it in race mode, and we've got the valved exhaust fully open. Certainly not an underpowered car, but 416 horsepower is very manageable. It's just the right amount of power. Very linear throttle response from the supercharged V6. This hydraulic steering rack is the absolute best in the business. So much steering feel. I can feel exactly what the front tires are doing, not only in terms of the bumps and the little cambers in the road that we're going over, but also this rack communicates how loaded up the front tires are mid-corner. It gets heavier as the lateral G's increase. The red line is right around 7,000 RPM. The engine does reward you for winding it out, but it's got plenty of mid-range torque as well. All right, so the downside is this transmission. It does respond when I ask it for a shift up or down, but you can definitely feel that little dip in torque between shifts. It's not the smoothest. Let's try a little straight line acceleration run here. See, right there, you actually have to pull the paddle when upshifting a little earlier than when you want the shift to happen. So much steering feel going over those bumps and crests. You feel exactly where the front tires are pointed, how much they're loaded up. Just absolutely delicious steering. What Lotus has always been known for. Woo! Plenty of mid-corner grip, but it doesn't feel like a hunkered down track weapon. It still moves around a little bit, which I really like for a street car. It makes it engaging to drive. It's not just full grip, full composure everywhere. It's exciting. The other thing I love about this car is the suspension. It feels so perfect. The suspension tuning of this car could not be any better for street driving. I feel every single bump on the road, but never is it harsh and never does it upset the balance of the car. Once you get used to this transmission and how you have to pull the paddle a little bit earlier, you can definitely learn to live with it and still have fun while driving aggressively. The brakes are just as impressive as the suspension. Super linear pedal feel. I can't get over the steering. Lotus steering is just top notch. Such minute control over the front end of this car. Now out here on Cup 2 tires, there's barely a hint of understeer. I've driven this car in manual transmission form on track at Sonoma Raceway, and there was a little bit of turn-in understeer, especially if you're aggressive on throttle. But out here, you'd be hard-pressed to make this car not feel perfectly neutral. Absolutely love the suspension. The way it handled that big bump, that crest back there, was probably the best I've felt in any OEM suspension of any car that I've driven in a very long time. This car is truly a special driving machine. It also has so much road presence. Just look at it. It's low, it's wide, it's aggressive. It's got a big front splitter, very aggressive rear diffuser. It has much more road presence than that Cayman GTS, even though that GTS, as we're about to find out, is a very nice spec. At the end of the day, it still just looks like a Cayman, which has a starting MSRP of roughly $60,000, whereas this Evora certainly looks from the outside every bit of 109 grand. And the driving experience, I would say, punches even above its pretty high MSRP. So with that being said, let's jump into the slightly cheaper and perhaps slightly less aggressive Cayman GTS and see how it compares. All right, we're now in this 2018 Porsche 718 Cayman GTS. This is not the GTS 4.0 with a flat 6 engine. This has the 2.5 liter turbocharged flat 4. It makes about 365 horsepower, and this car is a little bit lighter than that Evora GT, tipping the scales at just over 3,000 pounds. Of course, we've got a 6-speed manual transmission, electric power steering, and since this is a GTS model, it comes standard with PASM suspension and Porsche Sports exhaust. I love this little dial on the steering wheel. It reminds me of a German version of the Manettino on a Ferrari. So we're gonna throw this thing into Sport Plus, and we're gonna back the dampers back off into normal mode, PSM fully off, which is Porsche Stability Management. First impressions of the interior, definitely of a higher build quality, but also in some ways perhaps a little less interesting to look at. I mean, we do have some nice carbon fiber accents here, plenty of Alcantara and brushed aluminum. The shift knob feels very nice as well, and we've got dedicated buttons for pretty much everything. Let's see how this car with the 2.5 liter turbocharged 4-cylinder feels. Right away, that sound is not very Porsche. Wow, really good throttle response for a turbocharged engine. Good shifter feel. It's a little light, definitely lighter than a GT4 in terms of shifter effort. Oh, this engine has so much mid-range torque. Excellent throttle response, wow. It almost feels like a naturally aspirated engine in that regard. Plenty of front end grip. We're on some Apex wheels, 18-inch, with Supercar 3 tires. So similar grip level to the Cup 2s on that Evora GT. Excellent clutch feel. Porsche clutches have always been some of my very favorite. They have really good weighting, and they give you a good sense of where that engagement point is. Easy to heel and toe, despite the floor-mounted throttle pedal. Okay, so I do admit I'd much rather hear a naturally aspirated flat 6, or even a turbocharged flat 6 for that matter, howling to over 7,000 RPM. But I will say, this little Turbo 4 makes a pretty good sound. It's throaty. It has some induction note to it. Let me demonstrate the full range of sounds this engine can make at full throttle here. Not a bad sound at all, in my opinion. Now, this electric power steering rack is one of the very best in the business, in the world of electric power steering. But compared to that Lotus with its hydraulic steering, this just isn't as full of feedback. It's very precise. There's no slop on center at all. You can accurately place the car wherever you want, but it doesn't give you the same, number one, information about the road texture, and number two, it doesn't weight up quite as well when the front tires are experiencing higher lateral Gs. In those two areas, that Lotus steering rack is still a cut above. That's not to say you'd be disappointed by the steering of this Cayman. It's just that we're comparing it against the very best of the best. There's definitely some lag below around 2,500 RPM. This Cayman perhaps feels a little bit lighter on its feet, In terms of suspension, I think these two cars are pretty evenly matched. They both have really good compliance, with the Cayman in the softer mode and the Evora just having fixed dampers. But I think the Evora maybe gives you a little bit better control, on a canyon road at least. In the Cayman, I can feel the car just having a little bit of extra vertical motion over the smaller bumps. In terms of brake feel, the two cars are very close. The Evora GT has much physically larger rotors, front and rear. But on a canyon road, I think both braking systems are more than adequate. You can really get hard on that brake pedal into a corner. Woo. This car moves around a little bit. The addition of a limited slip differential in the GTS definitely helps compared to a standard Cayman or Cayman S. The corner exit traction is really nice. Handled that big crest pretty well. But yeah, there's just a little bit too much vertical motion, especially from the rear end. Didn't get that same feeling in the Evora GT. For that reason, I do think the Evora GT suspension is better tuned. Of this manual is quite long, but it's actually pretty well suited to this engine because there's so much torque. Longer gearing really makes use of that wide power band, so it's not as much of an issue in this car as I remember it being in the 981 generation GT4 Cayman with a naturally aspirated 6-cylinder engine. So in conclusion, how do I think these two cars compare? They're honestly really evenly matched. They trade blows in so many different ways. I do think the Evora GT has superior steering, superior suspension, and probably better brakes as well if you're into track days. But as a road car, this Cayman just gives you more comfort, more practicality, better build quality, and a more flexible engine. This 4-cylinder is more efficient and has a broader torque curve. Doesn't make as good of a sound. That's up for personal debate, but I would argue that the engine in the Evora does sound a little bit more special. Which car would I have? Well, considering this GTS is literally 15 grand cheaper, it would be hard to make a case for the Evora GT in terms of pure driving dynamics. When you factor in road presence and just that feeling of specialness, that feeling that you're driving something truly unique and not just a slightly more special version of something that you see everywhere on the roads, at least here in the Bay Area, you can definitely make the argument that the extra money for that Evora GT is justified. In some ways, the driving experience is justified as well, but it's just a bummer that the 6-speed manual version of that car is quite disappointing in terms of shifter feel. And the 6-speed automatic, while being better than expected, at the end of the day, it's still not a very exciting transmission. If they can just make the manual in that car feel as good as a manual in this Cayman, I think the Evora GT would be hands down my pick. Let me know what you think of these two cars and how they compare. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.